The panel today is called the Alabama Constitution's Racist Roots and 2022 Ballot Amendment. This is a very important topic for all of us as we work to improve Alabama and make voting rights more equitable for all, and also to understand what's going to be on the ballot in November. There is a 2022 ratification of the Constitution on the ballot this November. And so you're going to hear more about that as well. And so right now I want to turn it over to the moderator, Stephanie Butler, who is in Birmingham now. She was not long ago down in Dothan. We are so glad that you're here today to do the moderation, and I'm going to let you do the introduction and carry from here.
Yeah. So welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining the League of Women Voters of Alabama here in the Alabama Senior Archivist. I'll give you a fair view of why we're here and what we're talking about, and then I'll introduce our panelists. So in 2019, the Alabama State Legislature passed a bill to put Amendment 4 to a statewide vote. Amendment 4 gave approval for the Director of Nonpartisan Legislative Services Agency to draft a recompiled version of the state constitution. In November 2020, Amendment 4 was approved by the voters. The completed draft of the recompiled constitution will be submitted to the legislature this year. If 3/5 of the House and Senate approve the draft, it will be sent to the voters for final approval in another statewide vote this November. Today's forum, our panelists will help us understand the history of the Alabama State Constitution, the reasoning behind the changes being recommended, and they will talk about what might come next. The League of Women Voters of Alabama really hopes that today's discussion will help Alabama voters to make an informed choice on this issue, which you'll be voting on in November. So on the panel today, we welcome first Reverend Valtoria Jackson. She is currently serving as lead pastor of St. Peter's African Methodist Episcopal Church here in Montgomery. She serves on the Montgomery leadership team of the Alabama For People's Campaign and for Faith in Action Alabama. Scotty Kirkland is the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator at the Alabama Department of Education. Thank you for helping us here today. And the chairman of the Alabama Historical Association's marker. And to my right is Othni Lathram. He's the director of the Alabama Legislative Services Agency. In collaboration with the Legislative Committee on the recompilation of the Constitution, Mr. Lathram staffed the effort to create the draft that will be presented to the state legislature and then to voters in November. Thank you all very much for being here. Hopefully at the end, we have time to take them, but you hold them to the end. Thank you. So we'll start with you, Mr. Burke. Can you please provide some historical context to the creation of the current 1901 Constitution, and especially address how it was a response to the Reconstruction era?
Well, I'm happy to. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks to Kathy, all members of the League of Women Voters of Alabama for hosting this session today. The roots of the 1901 Constitution really begin in the election of 1874, and that's the election when Democrats in Alabama, white Democrats, white conservative Democrats, take back full control of Alabama's government, both the members of the legislature and the governor, bringing about an end to the Reconstruction era in Alabama. That's 1874. And almost as soon as Democrats returned to power the following year, early in the winter of 75, they began calling for a new constitution, which would have been the fourth constitution in Alabama in 14 years. And so it's a period of a lot of change during this era. So with very few Republican delegates, 5 of whom were African American, that constitutional convention looks like in 1875, it looks like what Alabama's government looks like is overwhelmingly white conservative Democrats. And so these new delegates, there were 100 of them, they meet here in Montgomery, and over the course of just 23 days, they establish a new constitution that rolls back most of the provisions from the Reconstruction era Constitution, the 1868 document, the only Constitution in Alabama's history that has included African-American signatories, and also probably the most broadly defined liberal governing document Alabama had ever had. And so the delegates in 1875 rolled back almost all the provisions that 1868 Constitution established, beginning with the preamble. The preamble of the 1868 Constitution quotes from our federal document saying that all are created equal, endowed by their certain rights. The delegates in 1875 changed that to say that all men are free and are equally free. And so a very subtle change, perhaps, but giving an indication of what would to come. The one piece that the delegates in 1875 do not change is the piece related to suffrage. So in 1875, there's still federal troops in several southern states, in Louisiana, and the delegates are very careful not to roll back some of these provisions that might bring forth, it might invite federal intervention again. The Reconstruction era is still very much close at hand, and so. And so they put forth a document that is a step towards what we see in 1901 without those suffrage provisions. And so that document lives for a generation. And that's right. Oh, wait. Test 1, 2. Further back. And so in that generation between, several forces combined to lay the roots of the 1901 Constitution, both internal and external forces. And so internally, you have really a generation of elections particularly in the Black Belt area of Alabama, where to preserve the power, conservative Democrats have to resort to election fraud, stealing elections outright, purchasing elections, and this goes on both at the local and the state level for many elections in a row. At the same time, you have the beginning in the 1880s of this era in Alabama politics called the populist revolt, where agrarian voters, agrarian residents start to buck up against this conservative Democratic trend in a way. And this is particularly pronounced in 3 important areas of the state: the Wiregrass region, in the North Alabama Hill Country, but also in the Black Belt, where you see for the first time a real coalescing of these two groups of African-American voters and of white populist voters around the Populist Party. And so twice in 1890s, the gubernatorial election is stolen from the populist candidate, Reuben F. Cole, who without this fraudulent election process would have been elected. And so in 1895, on Inauguration Day, Reuben Cole's supporters, both black and white, come to the Capitol. They march up what we know as Dexter Avenue. They march onto the Capitol. And they turn away, but it's clear to the conservative Democrats that are in power, that are in the legislature, and who are controlling politics in the states, that this particular coalition is dangerous. And that this long generation effect of trying to limit their elections by fraud and by deceit is not sustainable. It's not going to last for very long. And they say very interesting things to us now. They talk about how it bothers them that it takes so much effort to preserve the electorate that they see as pliable, as controllable, and they want to figure out a different way of doing that. And so then we get to the external factors. We get to what's happening outside of Alabama. And this really begins and ends with the Supreme Court. In the 1880s, the court takes a very conservative turn in the way they interpret the 14th and 15th Amendment, those two hallmark pieces of the Reconstruction era. And they establish then in the 1880s a very narrow view of those two amendments. And they take them from something that keeps a state agency or a state itself from depriving someone of their civil rights and their voting rights to making it an individual basis. And so that frees up a lot of states to start rethinking their own constitutions, to say that if a constitution that deprives Black voters of the franchise can sustain a court challenge, if it can sustain a challenge based on the 14th and 15th Amendment, then it can survive. And so what you see, because of these very narrow definitions that the new court is giving to these Reconstruction amendments, you see beginning in Mississippi in 1890, Southern states rewriting their constitution. So 5 Southern states between 1890 and 1900 rewrite their constitutions and establish all sorts of voter restrictions, and all the ones that we know well. Alabama comes late to this game. Alabama doesn't really start until after the 1900 election. That's when it becomes really clear that this path is made forward. And the other Supreme Court case that makes that possible comes in 1896 with the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which establishes this notion of separately and allows states and municipalities to codify into their laws a generation of de facto segregation and Jim Crow rule that is epidemic across the South. And so those court rulings really lay the groundwork for what happens in Alabama after 1900, this big push to get a new constitution. And so we're often surprised by the bluntness of the language that the 1901 delegates campaigned on, and the bluntness of that language that John Knox, the president of the convention, starts off talking about establishing white supremacy. But they weren't keeping this secret, right? The campaign slogan for the 1901 convention was white supremacy, suffrage reform, and purity in elections. These 3 things go together. It's what they're interested in, and they have no doubt when they come to Montgomery, those 155 delegates, the vast majority of whom are conservative Democrats, have no doubt that their viewpoint on restricting the electorate, on making it easier for them to decide who stays in power, on centralizing that government power into Montgomery, vesting that power with the legislature primarily and not with the people, they have no doubt that that is a viewpoint that's in ascendance. That's how they can stand in their convention on the first day and talk about maintaining white supremacy. That's how they can agree to have a verbatim transcript made of the entire convention, which is something that in the history of Alabama has never been done before, a verbatim transcript, because they knew that their viewpoint would survive a test both inside of the state and outside of the state in the courts.
So, Reverend Jackson, Mr. Kirkland just talked a little bit about how the Constitution was designed to restrict the political power of Black citizens and poor citizens, and especially to restrict that alliance from gaining political power. Can you please describe how these elements of the Alabama Constitution have impacted the lives of Black people and poor people in the state, and how does that impact still felt here today?
Again, I follow you, and thank you, League of Women Voters, and thank you so much for moderating today. It's an honor to be here. We know it impacts us. As you just heard, history repeats itself. You heard about purity in elections. You heard about these same states and these same counties that if you go to barriers to prosperity data sheet of the state of Alabama, those same counties are the poorest counties in the state. The state of Alabama is the 7th poorest state in the United States of America, but yet we are considered a red state, which is considered an elite state, As you see just blankly, as he just led to see in the 1800s and 1900s, they used white supremacy, which is a word out of my vocabulary, because there's nothing supreme about any color. We're all human and we all, have to live the same way. So basically still, these races and these type of strict written suppressive type laws that were written in the 1900s still continue today. They're just a little more flowery words and different ways they're pushed out. And then it goes in coupled with education. If you look at the educational scores of those same poor counties, the poorest counties we have, you look at the education for the math of people, you have a high literacy, you have a high school dropout. How do you understand law if you can't read it? How can you understand law if you don't have cable to search it and Google it? How can you understand law if your leaders in those counties, in black or white alike, are not teaching and making people aware of what these laws that are suppressing vote, suppressing women's suffrage? So yes, we're still a tree with these deep-rooted racist roots, and it's growing, and there's fruit. And there's fruit that's still out there, but I just say don't drink the Kool-Aid. And League of Women Voters, you're doing a great idea to help us realize which Kool-Aid, because the messaging, it still sounds good. And some would say, well, why do we need to revise the Constitution if it's not as blatant racist, but it's still carrying the same tone. I remember the day my mother had to pay to vote, poll taxes. And I was born in 1961. And I think she carried me into the polling booth when I was in her arms, which I did with my children. We have a culture of voting, and that's being lost as well because of the suppression, because you're not expected to vote. You're not giving off work to vote. Your community, you have long lines to go and vote. So we still have that mentality of these poor counties and even some of the more richer counties that African Americans don't vote. So when you get that message out, then you create an apathy that grows in our community. So it all stems from the founding framers of this Constitution that sadly, we need to enter a third Reconstruction. That's what Puerto Rico campaign is pushing, the demands for third Reconstruction. And I personally believe the only way we can reconstruct, we've got to tear it down and start fresh. That everybody's at the table. There's no women were at the table. So it was a poorly written Constitution. There was no women at the table, and then the few African Americans at the table, they were not looked at as 100% equal to those that were not Black or non-African American. So we have to get everyone to the table and rewrite this Constitution because its legacy still lives on today.
Thank you. Mr. Lathram. So I brought my son to come see the Alabama constitutions when they were on display. And one of the notes they put is that our current constitution in its form is one of the longest in the world. When did that happen? What is it about our legislative process that has made the Alabama Constitution one of the longest?
All right, so first off, let me end the chorus and thanking you all for letting me be here today. It's a great opportunity to talk to everybody that's on the Zoom. Grateful for it. I'm going to pitch. Also, you mentioned the exhibit. There was a fantastic exhibit on our 6 constitutions. Scotty wrote an excellent book that goes along with that. I think's on the table out front that he's graciously made available. Please pick one of those up before you leave. It's a tremendously valuable book. Looking past kind of the very obvious roots and initial purpose of the 1901 Constitution, let's turn a little bit to what the practical effect was, right? In addition to the very obvious things we've been talking about, it was written by a constituency of people that frankly was pretty consistent with the state of Alabama in 1819, and it's probably pretty consistent with the constituency of Alabama in 2022, and that the average citizen had a very strong distrust of government. They believed that decisions should be made individually and locally, which is a little bit odd to say, given obviously some of the home rule stuff that we know came out of that. But they wanted to reserve the power to the voters, and of course, the voters were white male landowners. So you have a very obvious racial component to that. You have a sex component to that. And so the document that they created was meant to substantially tie the hands of state government in almost every respect. I tell people, and Scotty may disagree, Scotty's the historian, I'm not, but looking at the document, reading the document, I don't think anybody would be more surprised still living under the 1901 Constitution than the people. These were people who were writing their fifth Constitution in a 40-year window. It was not written as a Constitution. Right, the greatest example of a Constitution, I think, is our U.S. Constitution. Right, it makes up about 5 books, which, by the way, the rest of it is only the statewide provisions of the state Constitution. That tells you where we're at. And a Constitution, at its core, students, my constitutional law professor in the room, so it makes me a little bit nervous to talk at this basic level. But when I'm talking to school kids, I tell them a constitution, in essence, is a contract or agreement amongst a group of people and their government, whereby we agree by what rights and powers we're giving government, and what rights and powers we as individuals are willing to cede and give up to live as part of a civilized society. At its core, that's what this is. That's not what this document. This document was a super. This document regulated how telegraph companies did business. It regulated how rail business. It literally micromanaged very significant aspects of ordinary life, the way that constitutions are issued. And what was the reason for that? The reason for that is that they wanted, the legislature didn't meet very often. And B, they wanted to make sure that before they could do anything that people might disagree with, they'd have to come back and get the approval of the voters. So the most basic example of that is that the 1901 Constitution prohibited the spending of federal funds on internal improvements. Now that's legalese, right? That meant that government couldn't build roads, couldn't build courthouses, couldn't build ports, couldn't build schools, not as a force of right. That was not a power which government had. Something we would all agree is pretty basic and pretty, kind of at the very simplest term, something you expect to do. So what was the First Amendment to the Alabama Constitution? The First Amendment to the Alabama Constitution was an amendment that said, no, state government can build roads. They can take its money and it can build roads, right? And then, the flood kind of started from there, such that today, as of the primary of this election cycle, we have 978 amendments, 30 already pending ratification. So 30 that the legislature has already voted passed are pending ratification. And a staggering 748 of those are local constitutional amendments, which means we have created an exception, a carve out of our state governing document that only applies to one county or one municipality. Can you imagine what the United States of America would look like if we allowed states to opt out of provisions of the federal Constitution, or if we allowed cities and counties within states to opt out of provisions? It'd be mind-blowing. We can all pretty quickly go to the worst case scenario of what things would look like, but that's a pretty staggering concept. And so, one, we made it required. We started amending it immediately because the power was so restricted. And then over time, people began conditioned to it and it became easy. Right? So in 2011, there was pretty significant movement to do an article by article approach to rewriting portions of the Constitution. That's when I started getting involved in constitutional reform, so to speak. And at that point in time, I kind of did a look back. Halfway point of the amendments to the Constitution as of that around 1992. 1992, we had about 450 constitutional amendments. We passed almost 500 constitutional amendments since then. Actually, right there, 30 years, almost 500 constitutional amendments. And most of us are conditioned to think that the voters vote down more constitutional amendments than they prove blatantly false. Since 1992, the ratification rate is 79%, north of 79%. That's skewed by one election cycle in 2010, where 20 some odd amendments were voted down in one election cycle. Of course, we all know 2010 was kind of in terms of kind of the politics of this state and its electorate in recent history. And so if you took that election cycle out, probably much closer to 90% on average ratification rate of amendments that are sent to the voters since 1992. So again, while if you kind of hold it, there's still a significant distrust of government. By all practical aspects, voters seem, very, very ready to accept constitutional amendments on average, usually because what is put before them seems so obviously something the government should already be able to do that the inclination is to vote yes. Right? An example of that was the one everybody voted on May 24th. At almost 80% positive voting rate for ratification is easily ratified, allowing the state parks to issue $85 million in bonds to improve state parks. I think the average citizen probably thinks state parks have the ability to raise their own money, govern their affairs in such a way that every voter in the state isn't required. Yep, we did. So.
Mr. Kirkland, faults in our Constitution have been long recognized, and a lot of the issues have been brought up here this morning. But it's never been addressed. So can you tell us about past attempts at constitutional reform and talk a little bit about why these efforts have not been successful?
I'm happy to. I'll say that from the outset, one of the reasons why it becomes difficult to reform the Constitution and the efforts to begin that reform start almost before the ink is dry on the document. One of the reasons why it becomes so difficult is because, at least when it comes to the suffrage and elections portion of that Constitution, the cake was so well baked. The suffrage restrictions worked just as the framers had intended them to. The election before the 1901 Constitution, there were about 180,000 qualified and registered African-American voters in Alabama, 180,000. In the election following the Constitution, where the new voting restrictions were put in place, that number fell to under 3,000. In one black ballot county, the number of registered African-American voters fell 99%. And all of these suffrage restrictions that limit African-Americans from voting also serve to limit poor whites from voting in many portions of the state. And so one of the reasons reform becomes so difficult is because the people who are so directly affected by it and who would benefit the most from reform have no voice in the process by this point. The legislators who are elected to serve those people aren't elected by those particular people. And so it becomes very difficult. But we found about 50 attempts to reform the Constitution from 1901 going forward. And there are a mix of efforts to reform it through legislation and a mix to reform it through litigation, court cases. The very first one came all the way to a head in 1903. An African-American postman named Jackson Giles, who lived here in Montgomery, sued the state on behalf of himself and other African-Americans who had been disfranchised by the new document. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, using those statutes that were put in place in the 1880s in Plessy, refused to hear the case. Well, they don't refuse to hear the case. They say that Jackson Giles has no status to challenge the Constitution as it was. It's a long and complex legal argument, and I encourage you to go find Brian Lyman's recent piece where he explores the history of the case, Giles versus Harris. This is the Montgomery Advertiser reporter Brian Lyman did a really fantastic long piece on this case a couple of years ago. But that's that first effort. After that, within the first 2 decades of the existence of that Constitution, we have 2 governors who come out. One of whom was a member of the convention, comes out and calls for a wholesale change. Emmett O'Neill, who was a member of the convention, comes out in the last year of his term in office and basically, as Othni pointed out, just sort of says, look, this is not working. The internal improvements problem is not working. The amendments, it's already getting too cumbersome. This was in 1915, 14 years after the document was ratified. In 1923, Thomas Kilby, in his last year in office, does the same thing. He comes out and calls for a complete redo of the Constitution, not because of the suffrage provisions, but because of the fact that it's already clear that it is not a workable solution to government. And these are people that are within the establishment. They're not, they're not outsiders, but they come out and they say in those last state addresses, basically, they come out and they say, we need something done. It's easy for the legislatures in both of those instances to just ignore it because it's the last year of their term. There's not much that, it's a lame duck situation, so it's just ignored. It's a little harder in the late 1940s, in the 1950s, in Jim Bolson's 2 terms as governor, to ignore him. One, because he comes into office on sort of a populist on a rise of populist votes, and he's considered an outsider. And 2, because he does that one thing that the governor has the real trump card in terms of the legislature. He calls a special session, and the governor can, of course, dictate some of the terms of a special session. So in his 8 years in office, in his 2 terms in office, Folsom calls 3 special sessions related specifically to the Constitution. Nothing comes from them, but there is a direct time where the legislature has to come together to at least try to make some headway. Nothing really happens. And so there's no real movement there for quite a while until we get to the 1 term of Governor Albert Brewer in the 1960s. And I think more so than any other governor, both in office and outside of office, Governor Brewer does quite a lot to aid the cause of reform. So he establishes in 1969 a constitutional study committee, a revision study committee. This committee outlasts his term as governor, and a couple of years afterwards, in 1973, they start issuing their reports. The legislature doesn't take action on the report. It doesn't take action on the entirely new proposed constitution that this commission drafts. But portions of that suggested report, specifically when it comes to the judicial article, the way that Alabama's court system is established, that plants a seed that then is picked up by Senator Heflin or Judge Heflin and others, who then leads in a couple more years to a wholesale revision of the judicial article of the Constitution. So that's the first big change, and that comes in the 70s. Another attempt that happens is in Bob James's first year as governor, and this is something new as well. Bob James gets a revision of the Constitution through the legislature. He gets it through the Senate for the first time ever, but the House doesn't take it up. And so the path to reform is pretty clear as well. In the 1980s, you have a different track. You have Bill Baxley, who's lieutenant governor, and you have Ryan DeGrasse, who's a powerful state legislator from Tuscaloosa, that work together and they get a revised constitution through both chambers, and they want to put it on the ballot. They want to put it on the ballot as an amendment. So you vote on this amendment, and it's a new version of the Constitution. And then in steps the Alabama State Supreme Court. In a 6-3 ruling, they stop. They say this is not actually allowed. You can't have voters vote to change the entire Constitution wholesale by voting on an amendment. So that track has changed too. So the paths to reform over the course of about 6 decades begin to close. And most of those paths are closed by that point, with one exception, is what Othni talked about a moment ago. Those incremental, article by article, sometimes slow changes that are done through the process. And since the 90s, that's been the method of progress. And in 2000, you had the forming of the Alabama Citizens for Constitutional Reform, who come out and on the centennial of the convention, they talk about changes that are needed to the document. They talk about a new convention, but the practicality of reform in Alabama just really come down to the path that's still available, is that article by article incremental change. And that's really what we've seen for the past 2 decades, especially this slow change towards a document that works. Not so much a wholesale revision of the document itself, but making what's there work just a little better. And in terms of how we got here, that's really the path of 1901.
So Reverend Jackson, part of what is in the recompilation is to eliminate some of the racist language that is still contained in our current Constitution. But a lot of those civil rights violations in our Constitution have actually been remedied through federal legislation. They're currently not enforceable. Can you talk about some of those components that are still there but unenforceable, and also talk about why it's important to have that language removed, even if it isn't really applicable by law anymore?
I want to speak to the result of this language. And as most of you here have heard from the 2 experts on the panel here, but what we want to talk about is that harmony. And he mentioned it was not just race, not just sexism, but the wealth. The wealthy were able to do the voting. The wealthy were able to purchase things that the non-wealthy could. But then we have not even mentioned about the Civil War Reconstruction and Jim Crow era. Jim Crow era, those that did survive, the 3,000 that survived after 1901 voters, then they were incarcerated and their children were incarcerated. And what goes along with incarceration, the removal of your vote. I know personally firsthand, someone was taken in on a minor a violation, and the first letter he got in the mail was, "Your voting rights is very strict." And to a young man, he said, "I don't care anyway." I said, "Well, yes, you do." And so as a church, we're on a fight for voter restoration, along with Faith in Action, along with other groups that are doing this work, because there again, that's where our disenfranchised vote is. Also, as a result of Jim Crow laws and Black codes, the Black Belt still continues the most impoverished counties in our state. 6 of the 25 counties located in the Black Belt have at least 25% of their population below the poverty line. And it goes along with it's even a greater challenge for Black people in Alabama, because we only make up 26.8% of the people in the state of Alabama, but we make up 42% of those that fall below the poverty line. This is by no mistake, not only in wealth, but we also look at how tracts were written in the census tracts. If you lived on one side of the tract, your housing had greater value. You live on the other side of the tract, your housing had no value, even though you had the same square footage, the same amount of labor went into your home, but it just depended on what side of the tract, and we know that as redlining. So again, it goes along with wealth, it goes along with in Reconstruction, we had the Jim Crow laws, we had the disenfranchising, we had mass incarceration, and we still today. As we know, during the pandemic, the funds have been allocated to build more prisons. So again, there's a mass plan to incarcerate those that do not have the wealth to avoid incarceration, that do not have the wealth to be able to restore their right to vote. I just wanted to bring up those issues, and I also wanted to bring up from the Alabama Poor People Campaign, that's who I represent here today, the platform that has been put before us all is being pushed by poor whites, poor Blacks, are 5 sections. Number 1, we're demanding to establish justice and end systematic racism for the right to democracy and equal protection under the law. Number 2, promote the general welfare, the right to welfare and adequate standing of living for all Americans. Number 3, ensure domestic tranquility. We deserve the right to vote with dignity, to work with dignity at a fair living wage. Secure the blessings of liberty. We have the right to health insurance and the right to a healthy environment. And lastly, provide for the common defense, reprioritizing our resources. There is enough money to address the issues. Like you said, in the state of Alabama, they first said everybody could build schools, build city like water and sewage lines, right? But then it came back, and the first ratification that government would do all this. Well, guess who the government left out? You can go down to Lowndes County right now and see sewage in the backyard. Because in our rural counties, where it's heavily populated by poor African Americans and poor whites, you have to have money to build a septic tank. That's the only way you're going to get the sewage out of your yard. Government has not done that. And still today in 2022, in one of the richest nations in the state of Alabama, in the Black Belt, we still have sewage in the backyard.
Yep.
People that just want to live, just want to breathe, that just want to experience liberty for all. I hope I answered it, and I hope I gave more information than necessary to know why it's so important that we get this Constitution ratified, or whatever need. These two guys are going to do it and push that. I'm pushing the issue of why it has to be done now.
Do you think that the language itself matters?
Most definitely. Most definitely, the language matters, because that language got us to where we are now. And only God knows what it will take us in the next 10 years, because we're still fighting the same fight. Right? That same fight we're fighting, and the voter suppression is real. Look how quickly those laws hit all of the 40 states to suppress. You're going to strike out Soul Sunday, Soul to the Poll Sunday. You're going to strike out somebody bringing water while you wait in line. And in Alabama, we closed voting, the election sites. And where were those election sites located? In the Black Belt. Okay? And we did not increase any election sites in the state of Alabama where they need to be increased. So voter engagement is paramount. Voter suppression is real.
So we've been talking a lot about the need for these changes, these revisions, and the recompilation. But not everybody necessarily supports it. I read an article 2020 where the Alabama Eagle Forum recommended a no vote on the amendment that even allowed this draft to be written. Can you address some of those objections to the recompilation?
So, interestingly enough, Eagle Forum was for it before they were against it. Right? They first published their support for the amendment, and then later kind of retracted. I'm certainly not going to speak for any individual's mindset or his mindset. But I can tell you, a couple of things. Let me start by saying one of the most quotable members of the legislature during my 10-year trip to tell me, so I think nothing generates consensus for the status quo like change. Well, in the Alabama State House, that is certainly true. As soon as someone has an idea for how to fix something that everybody agrees is broken, suddenly the fix is never quite ever good enough, right? There's people who think it does too much. There's people who think it does too little. There's people who think there's a better way of going about it. And frankly, there's some people who just because of the politics of it don't want to see change because it is better to have something that you can point to that is so demonstratively bad or misguided that it is beneficial to kind of keep that, and keep that in the corner of political political expediency. So, Scotty talked a little bit about kind of, the path by which we got here to this approach. And it is, it is a winding path that's full of dead ends. It's kind of like a maze, where you hit a wall and you back up, you try a different branch, and you hit a wall and you back up, and you try a different branch. I think there are some people, this is not the Eagle Forum objection, but there are some people who are against anything short of a wholesale new convention, right? I think that group has shrunk. I think that group has shrunk based on the logic of why would we expect that to lead to a different result, right? If we were going to elect, the legislature has to call for a convention, so the legislature would be taking an action that's against its own self-interest or limiting its power. How are they going to go about doing that? If it were to happen, it's exceedingly unlikely, but if it was going to happen, it would likely require the election of delegates from districts that probably closely approximate our legislative districts. So why would you expect a convention to end up leading to a radically different result than with the legislature? Right? Not very likely. Second, why would you expect that special interests were less on a convention and they have on the legislature? Right? They're very powerful special interests on every spectrum who are very happy with the status quo because over time they've got things to where they want them to be in the law. Right? Those special interests aren't going to bypass a convention. They're going to be there, trying to influence the outcome in the same way that they try to influence the legislation in the state house. So that process isn't likely to lead to a radical result. As Scotty said, the legislature actually in the early 80s, passed an entirely new constitution that was that the Supreme Court blocked from going forward. And then following that, kind of the most significant progress has been this article by article approach, which, by the way, Eagle Forum does support. And the interesting thing about the article, which I went back and read after we exchanged some emails earlier this week, was that they, their purported opposition to this process was wanting to see a continuation of that. And so let me talk a little bit about why that's a fallacy. So since 1973, the people of Alabama ratified 6 complete article rewrites within the Constitution. But what does that look like? Let's just take one of the more recent examples. Article 12 on banking was rewritten in 2012. The people ratified the rewrite of the Article 12 banking provisions. It amended several provisions, an entire article. How do you find it? That's Amendment 872 to the Constitution. Right? So even when we're doing these complete article rewrites, all that's doing is adding to the amendments. And so what does that mean? That means the average citizen has no idea what their state constitution provides. Right? I'm fortunate enough that I subscribe to the Code of Alabama. Volume 1 of the Code of Alabama it's called official, even though it is unofficial. It contains a recompilation. My office has been preparing since 2004. That kind of lets you read what the Constitution is. Even you can tell from the number of tabs I have in it, the amount of notes that I have in it, and the amount of cases I stuff. That even for me, it's hard to navigate. But the average citizen who goes and looks at the official Constitution has to wade through, and this is what's available on the legislature's website or state government website, looks at the official Constitution, has to wade through approximately 290 sections of the Constitution, and then almost 1,000 amendments. What does that mean in the context? One example of the sorts of things we're talking about whether it matters or not, right? Why I think it does. Section 102 of the Constitution of Alabama of 1901 prohibited interracial marriage and prohibited the legislature from passing a law to allow for interracial marriage. Obviously, at some point in time, the United States Supreme Court struck down those types of prohibitions and allowed for interracial marriage. Many years after that, in the year 2000, the citizens of the state of Alabama, after the legislature passed a proposed constitutional amendment, voted to repeal that provision of the Alabama Constitution. The repeal of that provision of the Alabama Constitution is Amendment 667 to the Constitution. So if I'm a middle schooler, let's just take it there. Let's assume every adult is perfectly capable of navigating what I just said. Y'all know it's a fallacy. But if I'm a middle schooler in the state of Alabama who wants to understand how my state functions and what my state constitution dictates, and I read through it, and I get to section 102, how in the world do we expect that middle schooler to keep reading through the remainder of the provisions and then 666 previous amendments, and then reach that amendment and understand, oh no, even though it wasn't enforceable, that my state no longer, the people of my state have ratified to no longer have that in my constitution, right? And so, in my opinion, where we're at, what we've done and what's proposed, and in the last round of questions, we'll talk a little bit about what that's going to look like on the ballot and how to understand it, is the next logical step. We continue to argue about taxes, we continue to argue about education, we continue to argue about these things before and after this, but let's at least take the step of cleaning it up, making a coherent, readable document that doesn't require duct tape, scissors, and staples to try to piece together to an average citizen. And then moving forward, we can continue to have all the debates that are necessary to try to sort things that are far more substantive than that. But do people oppose this? Absolutely. A lot of people think it does way too little. A lot of people think it does way too much. The amendment just to allow us to recompile it failed 4 times over 4 legislative sessions before it passed. Failed 4 times over 4 legislative sessions, being sponsored by the President Pro Tem of the Senate, the top Republican in the state legislature, 4 years in a row. Passed a bill, different versions, because it changed as we tried to objections to lead the recompilation and failed before soon-to-be Senator Representative Rika Coleman caught lightning in a bottle and was able to pass in 2019 the bill that allowed for this. And there's a host of reasons, things that were going on in the world that hopefully made that happen. A host of reasons that maybe a couple special interest groups fell asleep on the right day. We got some things done, but the truth of the matter is, it finally made it. This process went through. That's why I think it's important. But yes, people will oppose it for a whole host.
So we're coming right back to you. You keep saying recompilation. So what does that mean? What are we looking at? Give us a peek behind the curtain. What did y'all actually do? And what doesn't this law do?
So what we did, we had kind of instructions, 4 instructions that came from the legislature and then ultimately the voters. First, remove racist language. Sounds easy, it's not so. Right? I mean, we had hearings and meetings that talked about, is something actually racist? Is it enough that it had a racist impact that the language itself has actually been racist? We navigated that process very extensively. 3 significant changes in addition to the ones I've already talked about that have kind of already been made, but that will also be cleaned up. Right? The first is section 32, which is the state prohibition on slavery and indentured servitude, contains a phrase at the end of it, except in the case of persons convicted. Right, that language is in the federal constitution, it's in a bunch of state constitutions. Very, very clearly that provision was put in 1901 under the cover of it also being the federal constitution, but to create a system in Alabama whereby we most definitely had slavery by certain seasons of agriculture, providing work, a number of people, predominantly people were arrested, and those people would be leased back as convict labor. It ended approximately 90 years ago. Second, section 256, which is in the education article, This is one that over the years has led to a whole lot of debate, a whole lot of consternation. A lot of people I respect, a lot of different views on all sides of that. This is one of those that very clearly will not go far enough for some and is going too far. But basically in response to education, the Alabama Constitution was amended from blatant segregation to have permissive segregation, which is getting removed in this new recompilation. And then third, the removal of the last remnants of the poll tax. There are a number of poll tax provisions that were repealed in 1996 as part of the rewrite of the suffrage article. There's still one remaining poll tax provision in the education article. We'll figure that out. Secondly, to recompile the document, placing amendments that have passed over the last 120 years and removing those. An obvious example, as I've talked about the interracial marriage provision, now can just go away. These articles that have been rewritten, the old language will go away, the new language will be inserted. We opted very intentionally, it was not an easy decision on my part, the original numbering, simply because there are so many judicial opinions, there are so many bond opinions on the issuance of local bonds. There's a whole host of things that have gone on statewide years that we want to cause as little potential chaos as possible. We don't want people opposing this just because they're worried about the potential of that chaos. So we kept the original numbering, but we have removed explicitly repealed language and placed in newly passed language. Third, we've organized the local amendments. As I said, I didn't even bring my volume. Second volume, almost this long, the 776 local constitutional amendments. We've created a structure whereby those will be organized first by county and second by subject matter. So that, for instance, you can look for Amendment 5 across all 67 counties, and those counties that have an economic development allowance for their county will be placed as that amendment in every county. And the counties that won't have an Amendment 5 in their county. And we've done that based on, I think it's 13 subject matter topics and then geographic location, so that we've given an actual organization to local amendments so that people can figure out the county and city they live in, what differences exist there than in the Constitution as a whole. And then third, we've attempted to take out some of the duplication in economic development. That was the fourth charge. 70 some odd of almost 1,000 amendments relate directly to economic development. There's a whole host of duplication. Again, we touch those with a very, very light system. There are so many local bond issues, so many local governance issues that are tied to those various amendments. We didn't want anybody to feel like that their steel plant or their car plant or their local economic development project was going to be in jeopardy because of changes to this document. So we touch those very, very lightly, mainly in an organizational structure. So we didn't do a whole lot of change there, less than a lot of people would like to have seen, but did that very intentionally to try to
minimize. So Mr. Kirkland, if this amendment passes, what does the future look like? Are there any new opportunities for legislation and governance in our state based on this new structure?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to address that. But before I do, I just want to say that, I am personally very glad and very thankful that this entire process has somebody at the helm like Othni Lathram. As you can see, just from the last 10 minutes or so, the grasp that he and his staff have on this particular elephant is really, really important. And it's somebody that watched a lot of those committee hearings where Othni helped work with the committee through these specific questions of language, but also of those unintended consequences. And unintended consequences is that phrase that has a lot of weight in any legislative committee room, to look forward and to think about all the ways that the document can address these issues, but also in such a way that it's not going to get bogged down in the process of it. I think it's just been really great. And so I think we all, for the version of it that we can clearly see, I think we all owe you and legislative services a real debt of gratitude for that. So thank you. That being said, I think personally, historians are never really good at predicting the future, and any of them who are really should get out of the business. But I think that a recompilation vote is a step in the right direction, and I'll tell you why. And I think that, you asked me the question about what this portends for the future. The future is not really written, but what I think this recompilation does is it creates, for the first time, I think, in the history of efforts to reform the 1901 Constitution, I think it creates a baseline for debate, a new baseline about the type of governing document that we want to live under and that we want to operate under. As Othni said, the recompiled Constitution will clean up this cluttered document, and in doing so, also I think takes off of the table several sticking points that in the past have held up reform. This question is so enormous, and we've seen in various iterations of people talking about reform that it's really difficult to know where to start. Well, the local amendment process is so Byzantine, and we have to cut through that. But then there's also the language question. There's also the practicalities of it. But there are these big questions too. What the recompilation does is it takes some of that off the table going forward. It removes the outdated and racist language. It groups those local amendments. It makes that process much easier for the public to dissever what's actually in the document that applies to their county and municipality. And it provides, I think, a clear picture for us, not just that middle schooler, but for everybody, of what's in the document, what we have lived with and lived under for all these years, without changing, by the way, a word of the document, other than removing the pieces that the committee voted for. It will be the same document. And I think this gives us a reference. This gives reformers in the future a clear picture of the work that remains to be done. Those big questions of taxation, of funding for education, of home rule, all that's still on the table. But also those bigger questions, those broader questions like Reverend Jackson talked about. Whose voice matters? What do we value? I think talked about a constitution as a contract with the people. Those are those big questions that still lie before us. And the future of those questions is unwritten at this point and is unaddressed really in the recompilation. But when it comes to changing a document that's this old and this entrenched, this is still a high mountain to climb. Really, whatever the voters' beliefs broadly on constitutional reform might be, I don't think it's dangerous at all to vote for recompilation so that we can better define the question of the debate going forward. And to me, that's why I think this is important. In November, a step worth taking because it will frame up that debate in, I think, a much more useful way for whatever does come next. Just by happenstance today, 9 years ago, I posted a quote on Facebook from Robert Penn Warren that all of a sudden sounds very important to the moment. And right before we sat down for lunch, Facebook showed it to me. So you can thank the social media gods for this. But the quote was, "History cannot give us a program for the future, but it can give us a fuller understanding of ourselves, common humanity, so that we can better face that future." I think that really this recompilation does essentially the same thing. It gives us a better sense of what we might do in the future going forward.
So Mr. Kirkland just talked about the future. Reverend Jackson, in your position as a leader for the campaign, what does the campaign and the people who you advocate for want to see happen next? What do you think are the most important policy issues?
We can't think about policy if we can't pay our light bill. if we do not have a safe place to live. And you would agree across every line, across every socioeconomic line, neighborhood line, we all want to be safe. We want to see funds. We want to know where the funds are coming from and where they should go. We want it in plain language. And we also want to look at the numbers. If we look at it, there was 2.1 million people in Alabama that were poor or low income, and that was prior to the pandemic. And we all know what the pandemic did, correctly? And our health and economic conditions for poor and low income Alabamans worsened. So we want these issues to be addressed immediately. And we also want the voice of the poor at the table, and that's what Poor People's Campaign is all about, and organizing. I don't know if anyone has heard of Callie Green out of Selma, who we would have loved to have been on this panel, because she's living it, and she's living in stuff with others that's living these issues that are before us, that when we're so busy trying to just stay alive, we cannot think about a constitution. We don't want to hear about a constitution. We want to hear about amendments. We want to know the physical outcomes that will make our lives better so that we can begin to understand the Constitution, that we can have some interest in the Constitution. This is great. And again, I want to thank you for being on that committee and working so hard and making it so plain. Today, I'm so glad I'm here to hear this today, but we have to take it out. We need social media gurus out there pushing this simple language out to increase the energy to go and mobilize this vote. We must vote again. Do you know in 2016, over 640,000 people did not vote in the state of Alabama. And if you notice the percentages in just the last race, 7%, 2% voted in some of the counties. You know, I'm sure y'all watched the election, but you know, we're not even getting up to 50% of people coming out to vote, of eligible voters to come out and vote. So we have a lot of demand, we have a lot of needs, but in order to do that, you know, I'm talking to League of Women Voters, I'm preaching to the choir, we have to get out and vote. But we have to stir up some type of moral authority, some type of we just have to hear the voice from our poor people and empower our poor people, which all of us are in that class. We have to empower that their voices are heard and that those that are up to be elected are listening. And if they're not listening, we need to vote them out. But we also need people that is going to listen to run. This is what's so discouraging in the state of Alabama, because I keep my eye on the nation, and school teachers, moms, everybody's getting out there running. But in the state of Alabama, we don't even have candidates for half of the elections, particularly on the Democratic roster. Nobody's running. The League of Women Voters, y'all have the talent here to run. I don't care what age you are. If you're 80, you're not too old to run. You look at Philadelphia, somebody ran from their hospital bed. They had a stroke and they ran and they won. And so we have to go, and we have some bright young people in the Black man area. All we have to do is get behind them, empower them, and let them know their voices can be heard, and get behind them and get them on the ballot. That is what's going to make the difference. These are the people that are going to bring people to even come and vote on the Constitution. So they're doing the hard work. They're looking at the history. They're looking at the right language. You're looking at it. But what I'm looking at, we have to get people to the polls, and we have to find out how. Because right now, looking at all of the propaganda on TV right now, I don't want to go to the polls and vote. You're not telling me anything. You're showing me you're standing up there with guns. And those guns, and the people behind those guns, they say it's the people behind the guns, but these certain guns are killing our babies. And we can go out there and say tomorrow, start today, get up in your pulpit, ask the preacher, can you get in the pulpit, say, look, we want to save our babies. So we need to vote out all these men and women that are in Congress that are not changing the laws to save our babies. Just that taking one assault weapon or semi-assault, whatever that weapon is they keep using, they can fire off with 300 bullets in a minute. That are splattering. I think they need to see visual what these babies, they had to identify their babies by shoes. Okay, not even dental records would have identified those babies. And Years after Sandy Hook, where are the voices? And these wealthy people in Sandy Hook. So if they're not listening to wealthy moms that lost their babies, and in Florida, those high school students went to the Capitol to beg for gun control. To take your gun, you can have your gun, but keep your gun in your house and keep it safe. So what I'm saying for the people that we're advocating for, the people trying to get to go to Washington, I'm on the bus, come join the bus. We just about know that y'all would be so happy. Alabama's last on so many things, but in the Poor People's Campaign, Alabama led the way of filling the bus. And they came to us and asked Carolyn Foster, she's awesome, she's one of the tri-chairs. They came to Alabama, how y'all doing this? And we were able to fill our buses early, but we still have seats on the bus. If you can afford to fly to Washington, but be a part, it's not only about you say, oh, why you want to march again? It's not only about this mobilization, but to come together to show each other that the 140 million people in the United States of America have a voice. And they're hurting. You're hurting my brothers and sisters, and we ain't gonna let it happen no more. We ain't gonna be silent no more, because forward together, not one step back. That's the only way we're gonna change this nation. But right now, we have to focus on Alabama. But if Alabama get it right, look how we've led the way. We led the way in the Confederacy. We led the way in civil rights. We've led the way in so many ways. So Alabama now's the time to lead the way to change.
So Reverend Jackson and the Poor People's Campaign and the League of Women Voters, we're going to lead the people to the polls. But when we get there, what are we going to see as far as this amendment? How are we going to know which way to vote? What is it going to say?
So I'm very glad you brought that up. I saw it approved last week for the sample ballot. So we're used to having the constitutional amendments at the end of the ballot after the candidates. In between the candidates and the constitutional amendment listings, there is going to be a separate standalone section that is ratification of the Constitution of 2022. So immediately after the last candidate on the ballot will be a one paragraph description along with the yes/no vote on ratification of the constitutional amendment. The second thing I want to flag for you all to be aware of, the statewide constitutional amendments have not been numbered yet. I think I have a commitment from the Secretary of State to have about to describe be the last one, but I don't have that definitive yet, and I've not seen the proofing on that. But Act 2022-177 is a constitutional amendment that allows our office to take any simultaneously ratified amendments, so those 30 amendments that are pending at the same time as this recompilation, and to place them in the recompilation so that we don't end up day one with a new constitution and 30 amendments. It allows us to place them as though they were part of the original recompilation. Going forward, it's our plan to include similar language to that in each proposed constitutional amendment so that hopefully as we move forward, people will be ratifying not only amendments, but also ratifying the right for those to be placed in a way so that we don't end up back in the same situation.
Okay, so we definitely need to keep our eye on this legislation. It will be on. Audience questions.
Do you know if any of the candidates campaign against?
Not that I'm aware of. The governor has been supportive of this process. The governor signed the joint resolution that proposed the legislature passed proposing ratification of the amendment. I'm not aware of anyone opposing it. Certainly, I'm cognizant of some of those lower ticket races and how politics may play out. However, if that was going to happen, I would have expected some of that in the Republican primary, and it's not. So,
If we hear of the conflict and the campaign to send a senior person.
I'm certainly never afraid to reach out to folks and try to get them educated.
Kathy, how long do we have? How long do we have, Kathy?
Well, we were gonna be wrapping up here in about 2 minutes.
Got about,
But we were 10 minutes late getting started, so I think we ought to,
do we have time for a couple of questions?
you guys are okay with 20 more minutes? Is that okay?
Thank you.
You got a road to catch.
Does anybody else have questions? I'll bring the mic out to you so they can hear you on Zoom.
I have a question about the ratification of the 1901 Constitution. You mentioned that there was election fraud rampant in the years prior to the ratification. Was that election also stolen?
It absolutely was, and historians agree that it was the 1901 ratification election was one of the most fraudulent in state history, and the supporters would have you believe that a majority of African-American voters in the Black Belt voted to disfranchise themselves, to take the votes away from themselves. So in a few key places in the state, in a few wiregrass counties and up in the North Hill Country, there were enough votes against it to keep it from being ratified in certain counties, but it's ratified in almost every county in the state, and in any county where there's a wide margin of Black voters, it does appear that it was fraud. And that's a key criticism of the Constitution as it goes into litigation in the mid portion of the 20th century.
Hi. I'm trying to phrase this as a question if it needs to be, but it's really a comment. Is that okay? All right. It's really just a comment to say that it's really very rare ever on the side of Eagle Ford. But, and I, this is such an important issue, but it seems to me that we're again, for the third time, trying to say we're removing racist language, but we're not removing it all. We're only removing a little bit of the revision to section 256, rather than all 3 paragraphs, which said you can, give away your money to private schools. And very importantly, the first paragraph said there will not be any right to public education. We're leaving all that in again. And that's related to my second point is it's not only that it's so bad to leave it in, but at least in my view, and I admit I was an attorney in one of these cases, but there are prior cases that held it all unconstitutional. And this gets very complicated, and I think it could explain it probably better than me because I may have taught him than I thought. I do appreciate your work, and I did watch the committee meetings and all. And that's one thing I want to say. I'm not questioning people's good intentions. I don't even know where it all comes down because it's the recompilation aspects are very good. But to me, it is now leaving in and really redeclaring this is already still part of our Constitution. It says that first paragraph says, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed as creating or recognizing any right to public education. And to me, public education, and I know maybe that's just words, maybe that's just, and it's true that, the legislature still would have the right under other provisions to say how much they support and things. But to me, that's important. Words do matter. I don't know if there's enough support for public education now that this will coalesce and people will vote against it. I'm not even sure what's right, but at least to do what I'll do. But I afraid I may be voting with equal forum again. And I don't know that there's now any way to stop it, and I've talked way too long.
I respond to that real quickly.
Yeah.
So first off, I'm going to start this by saying that I have tremendous respect for Professor Morgan and your opinion, and it's not one I take lightly. I understand the argument. I understand the position. I respect the argument. And I want to avoid having this go down the path of what turns into, legalese and purely, lawyer on lawyer legal argument, right? So let me try to address it this way, right? What Professor Morgan is talking about is kind of a fundamental legal disagreement about what Section 256 is today, really is the starting point for then how you would recompile it. In the early 90s, there was litigation concerning funding of education in the state of Alabama. But believe it or not, right, and this is again something that I'm not talking on as a historian. I'm certainly not talking on behalf of the legislature, but my own opinion. The 1901 Constitution, for all its horrible flaws, was actually exceedingly progressive with education. There is not, that I'm aware of, or Mike could correct me, there is not that I'm aware of ever been interpreted under the federal Constitution to a right to education at public expense. Not to that level. States don't have a right to education at public expense explicitly set forth in their Constitution. The 1901 Constitution did that. It said that there was a right to public education for every child between the ages of 6 and 21. And then it said, provided, however, and it was a right for every child, provided that it was provided in a segregated way. So the 1901 Constitution, for all of its flaws, contained a right to education for Black children and Black children. Now, I suspect if we went back and looked, there was not much of an education that was actually being provided in a lot of those instances. But nonetheless, in response to Brown versus Board of Education in the 50s, the state of Alabama passed and ratified Amendment 111 to the state constitution that touched a host of sections throughout our Constitution to try inappropriately and ultimately unsuccessfully to create arguments that you could still have segregation despite what the United States Supreme Court ruled. At that point in time, that very progressive education provision was replaced with a provision that was far more progressive. In the 90s, that was challenged. We had a trial court that ruled that that provision was unconstitutional through a host of years and years and years of a decade plus of legal battle. No court beyond the trial court ultimately affirmed that ruling. So from where I sit as the code commissioner of the state of Alabama and lawyer to the legislature, the provision that is operative today in the Alabama Constitution is the 1956 version. That's what exists. Now, it's not operative because segregation is unconstitutional at a federal level, right? So as a practical matter, it is not operative. So what the people ratified, Amendment 951, that created this process, said that we had the power to remove racist language, did not give us the power to reinstate previously repealed language, didn't give us the power to rewrite it. It didn't give us the power to replace our judgment for that of what the people had done over the years. And so from where I sat, our choice was to remove Section 256 in its entirety. That was one option, at which point the Constitution would be silent as to education, as to K-12 education, and maybe that's preferable. That's preferable. But it was not an option to reinstate the 1901 language in a rewritten. Where we landed was to remove the explicit racist provisions of Section 256 and put it out that way, as opposed to removing the entirety of the section. I respect very strongly the opinion that that was the wrong choice. I respect arguments that were made as part of that course of litigation, but at the end of the day, I also respect where that case ended in the view of what the rules are, and how I then have to interpret the Constitution for the purpose of the legislature. And so that's kind of a little, probably more background than anybody wants. I certainly didn't want to confuse the issue more than to help clarify it, but I do think it's important, you know, as we go down the path, particularly if that's an argument that's going to come about, that people educate themselves on the full context of that issue.
We want to take some questions from online. Are there any questions? No questions? Okay. Well, then
So there will be an opportunity to keep the conversation going after we've closed out today. If you have follow-up questions that we didn't get a chance to address today, please email them to admin@lwval.org. Say that one more time, admin, ADMIN, @lwval.org. And these kind people have offered to follow up with us. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Go ahead, Mr. Mark.
That is one question, will the recording, available?
Well, it is, but we've also got it on live stream, Facebook, if anybody goes, if you go to LWVAL, Facebook.
Yeah, we do hope that you share this conversation with your friends, family, coworkers, churches. It's really important that people understand what they're going to vote on November 8th. And in that vein, there is information you can read on the state legislative website. The easiest way to find it is at sos.alabama.gov. And they have a link to the information about the recompilation. Please share it with your friends. We do want everybody to go to the polls informed. Thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate your expertise very much. Reverend Jackson, thank you for being with us. Your organization is at forpeoplescampaign.org, and June 18th is the rally in Washington. I will be on the bus from Birmingham, so I'll see you there. There's a few seats left if you would care to join us. And like I said, I brought my boys to the Constitution display, and there's also a wonderful display on suffrage right now. So if you ever have the chance to come up and visit archives, they do fantastic work about the history of Alabama. Thank you very much for hosting us and for joining us today.